Hello, welcome everyone to our video presentation. I am Lori Osborne. I'm the director of the Frances Willard House Museum in Evanston, Illinois. We're glad you're watching this video with us today. I'll give a little bit of background just in case you don't know. The Frances Willard House Museum was home to Frances Willard, 19th century suffragist and social reformer. Willard was the longtime president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was the largest organization of women in the world by 1895. You can find out more about her home, her life, and the WCTU on our website, franceswillardhouse.org. You can also find out details for doing research in our archives or taking a tour of the house there as well. We are excited to bring Do Everything 2022 to you via our YouTube channel this year. Each year, we honor Frances Willard's birthday, which is September 28th, 1839, by exploring a theme related to her motto, Do Everything. Do Everything was a central idea that defined her energetic and broad leadership style and her reform strategy. This year, it was easy to choose our focus, as a new biography of Willard titled Do Everything is being released this month. It's the first new biography of Willard in 35 years. I want to welcome the author, Dr. Chris Evans, to our program today. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Lori. It's great to be here.
We're so glad to have you today and excited to share this new biography that's coming out.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
So Chris Evans is professor of the history of Christianity at Boston University. He is published widely in the fields of American religious history and religion and popular culture. His previous books include The Social Gospel in American Religion, Histories of American Christianity, and The Kingdom is Always But Coming, a Life of Walter Rauschenbusch. Dr. Evans has lectured and taught in numerous professional settings and been a convener and presenter at academic conferences. Chris worked closely with our archivist, Janet Olson, who's here today as well, as he researched the biography, and she will be leading the conversation today. Hi, Janet.
Hi, Lori. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Janet.
So Janet has been the part-time archivist for the Frances Willard House Museum and WCTU archives in Evanston since 2007. Meanwhile, from 1998 until her retirement in May of 2020, she was the assistant university archivist at Northwestern University. She's written articles and exhibit catalogs and has an MA in history from Loyola University, Chicago, with a research focus on 19th century social reform. And I'm so glad to have the two of them here to talk about this new book and share the process of creating it, doing the research, and discovering a story of Frances Willard. And so I'll let them take it away. Thanks so much to both of you.
Thanks, Lori. So, Chris, it's so nice to see you again after we've it's been a while since you've been in the archives, almost
Yes,
a year.
Yes,
yeah. So great to have you here to talk about the book. I guess that means you won't be back in the archives for a while, but we'll have your book.
You never know, Janet. There could be a sequel in the works. Who knows?
I'm hoping that there will be. Yeah. Don't want to push that too hard yet. You need to recover from this book first. So let's talk about your book. And here it is, Do Everything, the biography of Frances Willard. So let's start by talking about the title, because of course that's what really connects to the Frances Willard birthday commemoration. So how did you, so looking at the other biographies that have been published of Willard, As we said, the last one was 1986, I believe. But there have been a number of biographies since Willard's death, and their previous titles were The Beautiful Life of Frances Willard, Frances Willard of Evanston, From Prayer to Politics, and Frances Willard, A Biography. There was also a kid's book called The Uncrowned Queen.
Mhm.
So your title is a lot different from those. Why did you call the book Do Everything?
Well, Janet, on one hand, the title seemed very appropriate in that the phrase "do everything" was a slogan, and really it became kind of an unofficial mantra for the WCTU during Willard's presidency. And while other historians, other scholars who've written on Willard have certainly made reference to it, to that particular slogan, it just seemed appropriate to use that because it was such an important part of who she was, both as a leader, but as a person. One of the things that I really emphasize in my book, from a very early age, Frances Willard was a dreamer. She was really devoted always to the idea of bettering herself, particularly through studying and learning. But as she grew older, the interests that she had in women's causes was really at the forefront of her mind. So more than just a way of galvanizing the women of the WCTU to action during Willard's presidency, I think the term "do with everything" is such an appropriate summation of the way that Willard emphasized, particularly to women, the importance of engagement. In some respects, you could say that the "do everything" slogan was her belief that whenever women encountered a particular cause or issue that was important to them, that they needed to become involved in it. So in a lot of respects, what I think is important about the "do everything" title for the book, on one hand, it tells us a great deal about Frances Willard's public career as a temperance leader, as a suffragist, a larger activity in women's rights, and her work, particularly in the latter part of her life, on issues of economic justice and reform. So it gets at the public side of Willard, but it also really reflects her drive, her curiosity, her sense of always wanting to better herself, and the way that she was able to carry that sense of enthusiasm on to other people who were in her orbit.
Oops, here we go. So when did she come up with the "do everything" policy? When did she start making that, part of the WCTU's program and of her life? And I'll also show, this is the book that she wrote called Do Everything, that was published in 1895. So, by that time, the "do everything" policy was an important part of the WCTU's mission. So when and why did she come up with it?
She really started to use that slogan during her presidency of the Illinois WCTU in 1879. And this was in the context of one of the major events in her public career, where she garnered national attention in Illinois, where she was working on an initiative to try to grant local, what was often referred to as local option suffrage for women, to vote on whether or not towns would actually provide licenses for saloons. This was part of another one of Willard's great mottos, home protection. The idea that, again, women had a special obligation to protect the sanctity of good Christian homes. And the way to do that was through giving women the ballot. But I think when she first started to use the expression do everything, it really was more of a general assertion that women needed to get involved. And she tended to really emphasize again, initially that women had an obligation, if they were concerned about the abuses of alcohol, then they needed to let people know about it. And her ultimate objective, of course, was that she wanted to see women garner the ballot so they could make a direct impact on legislation that had to deal with alcohol. But the interesting thing about the do everything mantra, it didn't take Willard long in her presidency of the WCTU, after she was elected national president at the end of 1879, to really employ that term to reflect the way that the WCTU kept adding different causes to women's activism. And one of the things, again, that Willard was she was a master of many things, but her annual addresses at WCTU conventions were really just media events. She knew that the eyes of the nation were going to be on her when she was speaking to hundreds of women at national WCTU conventions. And she would always lay out her agenda for the coming year. And almost without exception, year after year after year, a new agenda item was being added to the WCTU. So there was an emphasis, of course, on the goal of national prohibition. But you also had support for women voting on measures related to local option, whether or not communities were going to license saloon. And then Willard said, well, if we're voting on saloon licenses, we might as well be able to vote on anything that deals with society. So then you have the push for universal suffrage. And then that adds a whole host of issues over the context of her long presidency, where it seemed like every year something was being added to the do everything agenda. And Willard was always very clear about the fact that not everyone had to be on the same, rowing the same oar, so to speak. Women needed to pick up the mantle on any cause that was important to them. So whether it was supporting the WCTU's efforts to open coffee houses or public water fountains on one end, or working for women's suffrage, working for issues of economic justice. By the early 1890s, the WCTU had a department related to promoting world peace. There was also a department related to trying to prevent cruelty to animals. There were just a whole slew of work areas, and all of these, again, represented very specific causes. So Willard always insisted on the idea that women were going to have different interests. But the idea was, well, if you're working on one particular issue, it's great that you have women who want to engage something else. So as the WCTU grew as an organization, do everything increasingly became a motto for, in effect, saying, well, we're working on all of these other causes. What's next? What else are we going to add to the list of causes that are important to women? And I think one of the things, again, that was so effective about Willard is that motto, number one, it attracted a great deal of media attention, but more importantly, it made women's leadership extremely visible, whether it was on temperance reform, whether it was on suffrage, whether it was on working in coffee houses. The causes just kept multiplying, and Willard was always very clear about the fact hey, if there are women on the national and more importantly local level who want to take up something, they should have the freedom to do that.
Yep. Yeah, I was going to read the one out of not out of your Do Everything, but out of the Willard's Do Everything, where she says, everything is not in the temperance reform, but temperance reform should be in everything.
Mhm.
And she also said virtues like hounds hunt in packs.
Mhm.
So she's always using her, as always, colorful language to emphasize that there are so many ways to achieve these goals that will benefit society, and that women could do that on their own. They were empowered to take charge and do these things.
And
So
I have to say too, Janet, just building on your comment, I think a lot of her commitment to the Do Everything policy really comes from her mother's influence. Her mother, for Willard, was just a reflection of just the possibilities of women in leadership. In some respects, Mary Hill Willard did have a very traditional role as a wife and mother, but she encouraged Willard as a child and as an adult to dream big. And in some ways, I think the kind of optimism that Willard had as a leader was behind a lot of her push to engage a variety of reform issues. And so much of that emphasis, I think, comes from her mother.
I think so. Mrs. Willard encouraged all three of her kids really in creativity and in thinking and in writing and in all that stuff. So throughout Willard's life, she's sort of exemplifying these things that her mother taught her and that she learned on her own as kind of a very introspective person, always wanting to make herself better and all that. So how do you think Do Everything relates to her leadership style and her organizational strategy? I mean, did it work for everybody that she was talking to?
It worked for a lot of women, not for all, however. One of the things about Frances Willard as a leader, there is no question that she was the boss. Willard
Right.
did not suffer fools gladly, and she could be at times very harsh in her dealing with those who criticized her policies. But I think one of the things that you see with Willard, there's an interesting balance in her leadership style between her ability to really gear and set the agenda for the WCTU as a national organization, and also internationally, when you see in the 1880s the development and the flourishing of the world's WCTU. She had an amazing charisma and an amazing ability to really get people to follow her vision. But I think one of the things that made her a success is that she, excuse me. Sorry about that, Janet. I think one of the things that made her such a success as a leader is that she was able to democratize the organization. She allowed women to pick causes that were important to them and to follow those causes. One of the things that really struck me in my research in the Willard archives are the number of letters, particularly from younger women, who always mention the fact, I wouldn't have been willing to jump into a leadership role in the WCTU or even in some type of other women's organization without your example. So I think, again, the way that she balanced that paradox, the problems that Willard ran into, and these are things that I talk a lot about in the book, there was a very strong movement, certainly in the WCTU, and a number of women who really got to a point where they felt, well, Willard is taking on every issue possible except temperance. By the 1890s, in fact, there was quite a bit of anger among some very powerful women in the WCTU. In fact, some of these women actually left to form a rival WCTU organization in the 1890s. But I think, again, it reflected the sense of, well, Willard is just taking on all of these issues, and it's becoming too diffuse. We're losing focus on the centrality of the temperance issue. Now, what Willard could do very effectively, though, is she knew her history well. And one of the things that she was able to constantly point to, whether she was talking about issues of temperance or women's rights, she was able to say to women, reform is never single issue. That when you look at temperance, it's easy to sort of stop there. But if you look closely at that issue, you begin to get into issues of economic justice. And if you get into issues of economic justice, you're going to look at the issues of how oftentimes women and children are suffering a disproportionate amount of abuse, particularly at the hands of men because of alcohol. And if you're looking at these issues, then you have to look at poverty. So Willard was able, very sincerely, I think, to really bring out a lot of these different arguments, to say, in effect, that when you talk about temperance and prohibition, it's not a one-headed monster, so to speak. There are so many different components to it, and if you simply concentrate on trying to stop drink, you're not going to be able to engage all these other issues that, in a sense, are at the root cause of problems associated with excessive drinking.
So she did empower people. I know she could be kind of a micromanager, but what she did that I admire, and actually, well, my final question is going to be about this, but that she, even people who disagreed with her had been empowered by her example of leadership to the point where they could differ with her and say, I don't agree with you on this, so I'm going to go in this direction. So
right.
She gave them the power, even when she was, differing with or contradicting or, not doing something. Another woman could pick up that energy and go with it.
That's right.
Yeah. Now, so let's talk about your energy and tell us about your do everything process as you wrote the biography. So what's different from the previous biographies, and where is the everything in your interpretation?
Well, first of all, Janet, I have to say that this book could not have been written without the resources from the Frances Willard archives and library. Many researchers are aware of this, but it is just an incredible collection, both on the history of Willard, but also, again, the larger temperance movement, which by extension connects to so many other issues coming out of particularly the issues that we associate oftentimes with the Gilded Age and Progressive Era of the late 19th and early 20th century. So I would say that one of the things about my book is I do feel I was very, very fortunate to have access to a lot of materials from the Willard archives that other scholars have not looked at, or certainly when when the last biography of Willard was published in 1986 by a very fine historian named Ruth Borden. She had some access to Willard's papers, but still, again, a lot of things in the research I think were missing. I also have to say that one of the goals that I had in writing this book was really to the hope, and this is, as the book is coming out now, is my wish for it. I hope it will restore Frances Willard to her rightful place as perhaps the most significant woman of the late 19th century, both in the United States and globally. I think earlier scholars of Willard assumed Willard's greatness, if you will. And I think, again, when you look at Willard in relationship to a number of different movements of reform, she's not as well known, say, as women like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and others. And I think, again, in trying to bring Willard back to life, I hope the book shows that the temperance movement, again, was not simply a kind of narrow social movement by sort of these misguided zealots, as it is often portrayed, I think, in the media today. But the temperance movement, prohibition movement, was one of the major reform movements of the 19th century. And Willard understood rightly that this was a movement that was connected to the stream of other social movements of the 19th century, such as women's suffrage. And in writing Willard's story, one of the things that I really wanted to bring out, and this circles back, again, I think, to the personal side of Willard's life. In the context of doing my research, Janet, I was just always struck by Willard's optimism. Now, on one hand, you could say that was fairly typical of the late 19th century. I mean, she was really driven by this idea of the world is going to get better and better, and the 20th century is going to be great. So on one hand, we can kind of look at it from distance and really critique some of the shortcomings of Willard's vision. But the other part of it is, this is an optimism that is, I think, is and still has the potential to be very infectious. Willard was, for all of her optimism, she realized the obstacles that were there. And again, part of the story that my book tells at times is of a lot of personal setbacks and professional setbacks. She faced a lot of harsh realities of dealing with individuals who were on one hand going to honor her public status, but on the other were going to do everything they could to try to stop her. And these are realities, again, that I think are reflected still in some ways as you move through the 20th century and into our time, particularly when you look at issues of women's rights, women's equality. But the other part for me, Janet, is that when Willard used the term "do everything," it really seemed to me this is the term that really sums up her, as I really talked about a little bit earlier with you, it kind of sums up her life. It sums up, again, the kind of drive and passion she had to be involved, to really step out. As one of her friends said, Willard laid out these beautiful planks for women, and she led the way. She set the road, and then she beckoned us to follow her. And with Willard, the sense of possibility, the sense, again, that Willard always kind of came back to the message, don't we live at a great time? Don't we live at a great time? Now, that's something I think a lot of us in 2022 are not necessarily saying, But Willard looked at her era as a time of endless possibility. And even though, again, she recognized the obstacles, there is an invitation, I think, for women to not just dream with her, but to follow her on those planks on a road that Willard hoped would lead to a better future. So I've got to say, when I picked the title originally, it was kind of a working title, because I thought, well, that was kind of her motto, and that was one of the things that she's been known by. I mean, other historians have sort of used that label for her. But the deeper I got into my research for the book, and as I got into the writing, I thought this is the perfect title, because it's a slogan that really captures the essence, I think, of who she was as a dreamer. The final thing I have to say too, Janet, is it does capture the kind of religious faith that she carried that was so central to her work as a reformer. And that's, again, another, I have to say, a major part of my biography that I think other scholars have overlooked. She was an individual who really wanted to be an ordained minister. And the restrictions of her time didn't allow that to happen. But in some ways, she never had a church where she had a pulpit. But the WCTU, I don't want to say it was her church, but it gave her a bully pulpit that enabled her to speak to women and to speak to the nation, in effect, to say, these are dreams that we have the ability to make reality, but we have to work for it.
Yeah, so I think, yeah. So what you're doing with Do Everything, and what you achieved with Do Everything, is to sort of show her legacy. I mean, working towards the end of her life, to look at her legacy as that optimism, that energy, the enthusiasm, and the try it, do it, that sort of transcends any of the missteps she may have made, or failings that, based on her personality and her time period, and whatever that weren't so great, but that optimism and energy, and the feeling that women can do anything. I think that really transcends everything.
Enormous, Janet, I would add to your list, enormous personal charisma.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, her writing and what must have been her speaking style was so powerful. That, that is for sure. So I think we have covered everything from her. We have done everything.
Excellent.
So, except for having the chance yet to read your book, which we're all greatly looking forward to. So I'm going to wrap up by saying, well, first, happy birthday, Frances Willard, because that's the reason for our Do Everything Day, and the title of Chris's book. Also mention, and thank you, Chris. If I forget to thank you, I'm thanking you now.
Oh, so, thank you, Janet. Thank you.
It's been such a pleasure to work with you over these many years, and watching you do the research. I mean, that's the fun for an archivist, is watching somebody else do the work and come to the conclusions with the materials that we are able to supply, and say, oh, it's finally being used, it's being interpreted, it's being put out there for the world. So thank you, Chris, for that.
Thank you, Janet, and thanks for everything that you did to facilitate my research, as well as just other people, the many volunteers that I've been very privileged to meet over my years of coming to the archives in Evanston. But everyone associated with the Willard Library and Archives has played a major role in this book coming out.
Well, we were glad to do it, and we'll be there for the sequel. So I'll just say again that the book is supposed to be shipping soon from Oxford University Press. It can be ordered from your local bookstore, your local independent bookseller. You can order it through Oxford University Press. You can also order it from Amazon. And I'll mention that for local people, Chicago area people, Chris is actually going to be in person in Evanston on October 20th. At the wonderful bookstore Bookends and Beginnings to do a signing and talk more about the book, and we're very much looking forward to that. So anyone in the local area, you can sign up on Bookends and Beginnings website, and there's also a link through I think our newsletter had a link to that also. But so we hope to see lots and lots of people in person in Evanston, and we hope everybody's gonna get a copy of the book. And so I think that's it. So
Thank you, Janet.
until we
Thank
meet
you.
again, Chris.
Looking forward to the event in October, Janet. Thank you.
Yes. You're welcome.